right now.
A task force is expected to consider a range of strategies to tackle the issue of migrants crossing the English Channel. The newly formed group, chaired by the Cabinet Minister Steve Barclay, is due to meet early this week. Labour has accused the government of comprehensively failing to stem the flow of people making the journey across the Channel. The government could face a backbench rebellion later over changes to social care reforms in England. Ministers have been accused of favouring wealthy pensioners by changing the way the cap on care costs is calculated. Some Conservative MPs are expected to vote against the amendment later. Austrians are being asked to stay at home on the first day of another full coronavirus lockdown. Restaurants, bars, theatres and non-essential shops have all been ordered to close their doors for at least 10 days. New restrictions and vaccine mandates have sparked protests across Europe. LBC's correspondent Lucy Hoff says infection levels have risen sharply.
We have had a warning from the WHO that Europe could see 500,000 more deaths by February if the current rates across the continent continue. Widespread lockdowns here could prove inevitable, but as anger and attitudes harden here, more protests look to be inevitable too.
New homes and buildings in England will be required by law to install electric vehicle charging points from next year. Boris Johnson's expected to set out the new planning rules in a speech to business leaders at the CBI annual conference later. In the city, a short time ago, the FTSE 100 was trading up 30 points at 72.54. The pound buys €1.19 and $1.34. And the weather, chilly this morning with sunny spells for most areas, turning milder and cloudier across northern Scotland with some light rain, a high of 10 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Thomas Watts.
Welcome. This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call the Cabinet. Ask your question now. Call 0345 6060 973. This is LBC.
Good morning, 3 minutes after 9, Monday, November the 22nd. Yes, call the Cabinet in. And the relatively recent reshuffle, few promotions were as spectacular, or many would argue as deserved, as the one sitting, or the gentleman sitting in front of me, from a very successful vaccines minister, although I know the first thing he'd see would be to point to the scientists and the military and the NHS staff who actually got the jabs into all our arms. And I'm going to say all our arms because we all need those jabs. And now to Education Secretary. I speak of Nadhim Zahawi, who's in the studio with me. Good to have you here, Secretary of State. Just a quick one on the subject of boosters. I do have to ask this first. Noting you're the Education Secretary, but you will have seen widespread disturbances across much of Europe yesterday. Riot police being deployed in Brussels. Austria now, it is mandatory. Nadhim Zahawi, not that long ago, this was your brief. Do you see the UK going down that step? Morning.
Good morning. No, I don't. The really good news is that, one, the British people came forward, lined up, took the vaccine in very large numbers. We had the highest level of vaccine positivity probably in the world. Something like 94% of adults said they will take the vaccine or had already taken the vaccine. And of course, our four-step plan meant that we were able to open up the economy in the summer. Some said it was a mistake. I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. We will probably, I hope, without being complacent, be the first major economy in the world to demonstrate how you transition this virus from pandemic to endemic using vaccines. The most important thing is the booster campaign, because you have to continue to protect the most vulnerable. And as of today, if you're over 40, you can get your booster. Don't delay. Get out there and get boosted, because that's how we're going to make sure we have a really good Christmas. And I hope by the new year we'll be in a really confident place. We've got these new antivirals coming through as well, so that next year and the year after we'll treat it in the way we treat the annual flu vaccination programme.
Order a big turkey for Christmas? Mr. Zahawi, have the family round? Will that be safe?
Yeah, indeed. People have to be careful. I think it's still important to not be complacent. This virus is still around.
But there won't be a ban on social gatherings that you see.
I don't think so. The plan is looking solid. There is no evidence to lead me to believe, or the Secretary for Health or the Prime Minister, that we need to deviate from that plan. And we've had to make some tough decisions. You'll remember when we reached step 4, there were people saying, this is the wrong thing to do. Actually, it now looks, with the benefit of data and hindsight, that was the right thing to do because we'd reached such high levels of vaccination.
And finally, you talk about the hope that Britain will be the first country to lead the world as to how we move into epidemic as opposed to pandemic. Is it possible that's the spring? Your colleagues are aiming for that?
Well, look, we can't be complacent. The virus is still with us. It can still mutate. But all the evidence at the moment suggests that actually by accelerating the booster campaign, great to see the British people continuing to come forward in really high numbers on the booster campaign. Other countries are actually looking at our data to see, and of course our policies, to see how we've implemented this, but very much based on sharing information, being transparent, showing people why it's important to get protected, and people have come forward. Having that positive message has made a huge difference.
But is it March that will be there, the end of restrictions in March?
I just think that we've got to be careful, and I think we're on the right path. Yes.
Could it be March, lastly?
Well, look, I'm not going to sit here in November and say to you that we've just been through a grueling couple of years with this virus. All I can say is, at the moment, all the evidence leads me to believe that we're in a good place.
Will we still be wearing face masks in the middle of next year?
Well, look, I mean, face masks are a help for good reason, that in indoor spaces, confined spaces, that they do help and make a difference. But the reality is, all the evidence suggests that all interventions, other than the dreaded lockdowns, that the vaccines and the boosting of the most vulnerable is the most effective way to deal with this. We've seen it in Israel, we're seeing it in the UK now. Other countries, as I say, are looking at us as the model of how you transition this virus from pandemic to endemic. It's not over. The rest of the world needs help. We're helping the rest of the world. We're delivering 100 million vaccines. We've done over 1 billion vaccines from the Oxford team at zero profit cost for the world, and that continues.
OK, let's get to the callers. Thank you for that, Secretary of State. Robin in Whitehaven, you're the first caller. Go ahead, Robin, your question to Nadhim Zahawi.
I'd like to know if he thinks that the social care cap is fair, because rich people and poor people are going to be paying the same cap. I think it's another kick in the teeth for the less well-off, really. I just want to know what he thinks.
This is the row over the fact that it has escalated to, I believe, £186,000. There are mutterings of some form of rebellion. Just listen briefly, Secretary of State, if you would. One of your former colleagues, Conservative MP Robert Buckland, speaking to my colleague Tom Swarbrick yesterday.
I think it's far better to actually publish the social care white paper first.
So currently you're minded to vote against?
Yeah, the government must look again at this.
Revolt on the way, Secretary of State?
Well, I spoke to the Secretary for Health this morning, and I think there's a couple of points to make to Robin's very good question. At the moment, the system, as it stands today, if you have assets of more than £24,500, you start paying. Now, I think that does penalise the people who have the lowest assets, the lowest income in the country. We're quadrupling that, so we're lifting that to 100,000 in these proposals. It's worth remembering that. It's also worth remembering that something like 1 in 6 people get faced with catastrophic amounts of payment, and that can't be right. The new system, and by the way, Robin, I'm the first to tell you that previous Conservative governments, previous Labour governments have all ducked the issue, whereas this government, this Prime Minister, is determined to deal with it, to give people a system that is predictable, that they can plan for the future for, to make sure that they actually get the help they need. And of course, part of that is making sure we've got that cap right at 86,000. We will debate it in Parliament
Do you think
this week.
It's right?
I do. I tell you for why. Because I think you've got to get to a place where we can have a system that doesn't end up with 1 in 6 people having a catastrophic financial crisis. That is wrong. It also means that if you are have very low assets, and as soon as you get to 24,000, you start paying for your care. That's also wrong. We're quadrupling that. So we're getting to a place where I think the richest pay more, because the national insurance system that we are introducing means that the more you earn, the more you pay in.
You say that, Mr. Zahawi, but you'll be aware, Sir Andrew Dilnot, who was the architect of some reforms more than 10 years ago, has questioned this, points out that while someone who owns a £1 million house is able to protect more than 90% of their asset, someone with a home valued at £70,000 in a less wealthy part loses almost everything. Is this levelling up?
Well, as I said before, one, I don't think sort of saying someone's got an asset of a house of £1 million versus someone who's got an asset of a house for 100,000, 250,000 is the right way to look at this. It's the way to look at it.
Well, if you were faced with these costs, it would be, Mr. Zahawi.
If you're faced with these costs, the first thing that you're going to have is, instead of starting to pay, you actually get help all the way up to 100,000 of your assets, rather than the 24,000 today. That's a massive difference for people who have the least amount of money or assets available.
But it still helps the rich, and particularly the rich in the south.
No, but
you'll be aware of the 54 seats the Conservatives won from Labour just a couple of years ago. 41 have average house prices below the level you've just mentioned. So much for your red wall.
Well, except also the richest people will pay the most in through the way the national insurance system works.
Their homes are protected.
Well, everybody's home will be protected. You don't lose your home as long as you're alive, or your spouse is living in the home. But ultimately, the way we want to look at this is to make sure we create a system that's predictable, that's sustainable, and is affordable. And by quadrupling, so today, everybody is in a bad place. We know the system is broken. Governments have tried to fix it. They haven't dealt with it. We've come forward and said, actually, we're going to deal with this and make that cap work at 86,000 so people can predict, can plan forward, so younger people...
You're voting for it later today?
Well, I am, because I tell you why. Because actually, based on if you compare it to the current system, this new system is a much better outcome for people. You don't have to pay in now until you earn over... it used to be 24,500. It is today. That goes up to 100,000. You have a cap at 86,000, so you can plan forward. For the younger person now, can start looking to take insurance out to plan ahead, so that you don't have that 1 in 6 people face those catastrophic costs.
Let's move on. So, thank you for your call, Robin. David in Hampstead. David, you're through to the Education Secretary. Go ahead, sir. Good morning.
Hello, good morning, Nick. Fabulous show.
Oh, thank you.
House Secretary of State, I'd just like to ask, with the horrendous scenes that we saw 2 weeks ago at LSE, where the Israeli ambassador was hounded out and chased by a baying mob, I just want to ask that, as myself being a Jewish person living in London, I graduated from university, not very long ago. I faced anti-Semitism in university. Over the course of the last 11 years of the Conservatives being in power, this problem seems to be getting worse. And I'm saying this, by the way, as someone who has voted Conservative. The problem is getting worse, not better. Over the last 11 years, it's progressively got worse, not better. Where Jewish students, I experienced this, and people I speak to in our university, they're experiencing this. Jewish people are being singled out under the guise of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, which is really just a form of anti-Semitism. So the question really is, what practical steps, not what words, because I think yourself and your colleagues all say the right things, which is good, but it's not really enough. Because any other form of racism, this wouldn't be accepted.
So what practical steps are taken? David, thank you for your kind words about the show. Education Secretary.
So, David, thank you for your question. I think you're absolutely right. And when I saw those scenes outside the LSE with the Israeli ambassador, I immediately reached out to the ambassador and apologised. And these are unacceptable behaviours, in my view. Now, the
practical steps.
The Office for Students has just published the number of universities who've signed up to the international definition of anti-Semitism, which means that universities are able to implement practical steps that deliver best practice of how to protect Jewish students on campus, Jewish teachers and lecturers on campus. We've had a fantastic response to that. The majority now, over 90% of universities have signed up to it. I want all of them to sign up to it, because actually what we've seen practically in those universities who have signed up, it's helped them to deal with those incidents when they've occurred, because they've got a proper plan. This is sort of the gold standard when it comes to dealing with anti-Semitism. It shouldn't exist. I am determined, as the Secretary of State for Education, to root it out of our universities. I think, education, I said the other day in an article, is the vaccine against anti-Semitism. And I'm actually hosting a summit with the Union of Jewish Students and others to look at this issue and to look at what further can be done above and beyond the university signing up to the IHRA standard.
David, thank you for your call. Charlie in Chelsea, you're through to the Education Secretary. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Secretary of State.
Hi, Charlie.
My question is, with thousands of migrants reaching Britain daily, it shows the government is incapable of handling the migrant crisis. Why don't we hand it over to the military now?
Hand it over to the military. Sorry, hand what exactly over to the military, Charlie? You mean
the control to deter the invasion that is occurring?
Oh, sorry, control in Kent, in the Channel. Where do you? Just so that the Secretary can add wherever. Okay, bring in the military, says Charlie. Nadhim Zahawi.
So Border Force and the Ministry of Defence work very closely together on this issue. It is a tough one. It's very hard to deal with people on a small dinghy putting their life at risk. When you think what they are having to do this, one, it's completely wrong. We've got to, first of all, make sure that, and the Home Secretary is doing that already, sitting down with her French counterpart and to see how the policies that we all agreed on between the United Kingdom and France are being implemented. We want to make sure that surveillance, all the work that needs to happen to deter the people smugglers from doing this actually are being implemented. That's the first step. And then the way you root this out completely is you've got to change the law ultimately and make it that if anybody uses an illegal route like the route that's being used now with these dangerous trips, life-threatening trips on these tiny dinghies, these boats that these smugglers are putting people onto, is that you change the way we do our immigration system. And there's a bill in Parliament going through at the moment which will close the loophole. So if you come in through an illegal route, you will not be treated in the same way as someone who comes in on a legal refugee status through the legal route.
So what are the people in Calais meant to do if they're seeking asylum in UK?
So what will happen, hopefully, is you kill the business model. You end the business model, because basically at the moment, if they think that once they arrive on these shores, the legal system can be used to allow them to stay here, then they will keep doing it. But if the message gets out very quickly, by the way, and I've already seen it on the issue around, and we might get to this point, about what the Belarusian government were doing to weaponize migration against Poland and other countries. But once the message gets out that those people can't get through, then they very quickly
How long will
stop
this take?
Doing that. So the bill is going through Parliament. As soon as it's on the statute book, the message will be very clear that even if you get here after risking your life,
so it will stop.
You're not because you break the business model. You close the loophole. So the lawyers and others who
where do we take these folk back to?
So ultimately, if they can't be, if they don't have a legitimate reason to be here, then the safe country they entered, whether it's France or whatever European country they entered, is where they go back to.
Well, we might take them back to Italy.
Well, ultimately, it's the safe country that
the Italian authorities will accept them.
Well, there's been a modest number of returns. I think in total, not just this year, because I know what you're going to ask me next is how many went back this year, and I can tell you it was probably 5.
That's right.
Yes. But a couple of hundred.
So why should we have any confidence that this will change?
Because once
the change in the law.
Because once the business model is broken and those people can't use the legal system, then I think that will change.
Italy
things.
and Germany and France will accept these people lastly, Secretary of State?
Well, but that's the international law. These are the international rules that we all abide by, and that's
what
something.
Grade would you give Priti Patel for the way she's handled this?
I think Priti Patel is working really hard. This is really hard, really tough.
What grade would you give her?
I would say I take collective responsibility, and I'm not going to grade a colleague because we're a team, and ultimately we've got to deliver as a team. It's really tough. There's a review being carried out.
Well, I hear a task force has been set up.
Yeah,
what does that? Well, that's like the police. If in doubt, form a squad. It's exactly the same, isn't it? It just looks good.
No, but they do work. They do work. I've seen it in government, Nick, where when you focus on something, the way we did on vaccines, right? You pull all the sort of government resources together. This is difficult. Don't get me wrong.
Of course.
This is, it's extraordinary what these people are putting at risk, and I would just can't even think how
many people have approached you on the streets of Stratford-on-Avon to talk about this?
I've had some emails on this. People are concerned.
It's cut through, hasn't it?
People are worried. Yes, absolutely. It's an issue that worries the nation.
It worries the Conservatives, isn't it?
Well, of course it worries all of us. It should worry all of us. Look, net migration to the UK at the moment is negative, but of course illegal trips across the Channel in treacherous waters is not something that we should just turn away and think, well, we can't do anything about it. It's too difficult to handle. We've got to try and have a go and make sure we make it work.
Thank you for that call, Charlie. Anne in Buntingford, you're through to Nadhim Zahawi. Go ahead, Anne. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to ask, anti-vax protesters targeted my granddaughter's school, which was particularly frightening for her because she's autistic. Can the Education Secretary explain to me what he and his government will do to protect our children from this?
These are these vile protests where I'm sure you're aware, Secretary of State, but for my listeners' benefit, these protesters call out that children are going to become infertile, impotent, or possibly even die, all false, as a result of having the shot. Nadhim Zahawi.
And thank you for your question. One, you're absolutely right, Nick. It's all false and it is abhorrent, and it will not be tolerated. And
now, what do you mean by that?
Well, one, that the police, and again, I've spoken to the Home Secretary about this, and she has reassured me that the police have all the resources they need to deal with this. The anti-vax protesters should not be going anywhere near a school or a pupil or a parent or a teacher. And if they do, the police will and can take action against them. Local government, of course, are also working with schools. Local authorities, if necessary,
no one's been arrested in
have the
demos,
power.
To my knowledge, have they?
Well, as I say, if anybody feels threatened by these anti-vax protesters, they should report them, and they will be arrested. But
what about an exclusion zone?
Well,
so have your protest, but have it 500 yards down the road.
So local government can have buffer zones.
Would you support
schools, if they deem it necessary? I think at the moment.
What do you think? You're the Secretary of State
so
for
I
Education.
think I'm going to tell you what I think.
Good.
The best way to deal with the anti-vax protesters, which is the way I've dealt with them since I became vaccines minister, is to effectively always make sure that we deliver the evidence and the data and be positive about vaccines. At the moment you engage on their terms, you give them that sort of space to operate and cut through. I much rather marginalise them. These are very few incidents, very few.
But what happens at the school gates?
We've got over
grandma there, her granddaughter who has autism, so that must be an even greater challenge than for other kiddies. Those are all very, very sound principles and words. I think she'd like to hear that there will be an exclusion zone. Can you tell me now that you are ready to pursue exclusion zones for these anti-vaxxers?
Well, and we've got around 5,000 schools that are delivering the vaccination programme. These incidents are very few, as in you can count them on the fingers in your hands. The thing to do is not to play their game.
So you're not going to have exclusion zones?
Well, because I'd rather have the police deal with it, and local government have got.
So you want them arrested, but not exclusion zones?
Absolutely, because the moment you start giving them the space to think that they are somehow being prohibited, if they're
so you will urge
protesting
Priti
peacefully
Patel to talk to senior police officers. Let's start arresting some of these people.
She has promised me that the police have got all the resources they need to be able to deal with them.
And we will be seeing arrests.
If they threaten teachers or parents or students, absolutely they should be arrested.
You took on the brief at a tough time as regard education. I don't need to tell you that a number of children had been unable to attend school, but also attendances generally were very gravely down. What is the current situation?
So as of last week, attendance actually ticked upwards. So we are at 91.3% attendance.
What would that be typically, before COVID? Would that be broadly where you would expect it to be?
It would be higher. So attendance would be around sort of 95%. COVID attendance, COVID-related non-attendance is down as well, from about sort of 3% the week before, or the cut of data before, to last week's cut of data, which is good. Teachers, support staff have done a tremendous job, and I want to thank them on your programme. Anyone listening who is working in a school, is a teacher, a head teacher, a support staff, thank you for everything you've done, because actually all the evidence we have, and the Children's Commission did a brilliant survey called the Big Ask. 500,000 children, young people answered the survey. They want to be back at school. It's the best place for them. It's the best place for their mental health and for their physical health, and of course for education.
The former advisor, Sir Kevin Collins, suggested that the school day should be extended. You've decided against that?
So we've done three things. One is to look at those children with the least time left for them to catch up, to have an extension of an hour a week. So 16 to 19-year-olds, we're spending about £800 million extending by an hour a week the education time they get, because we think that's important. And then we've got an additional £1 billion for disadvantaged secondary school children and primary school children. That's on top, of course, of the 3.1 billion. So the total is 5 billion now. The big. But
it was meant to be 15, wasn't it? Sir Kevin Collins suggested £15 billion. I don't need to tell you. You got just a shade under 4.9 billion pounds. Are you lobbying your colleagues in the Treasury for more?
Well, let me scale up what I've got first and make sure I've got the evidence that it has delivered, because it's not just about inputs of how much money can I, it's not a sort of arms race.
Deliver?
How can we spend? What does it deliver? So let me bring that to life for you and your listeners, Nick. So I've just talked about the 16 to 19-year-olds, an extra hour a week, the billion for secondary and primary, plus the other 3.1 billion, so the 5 billion total. Now, a lot of that spend is going to go on tutoring. Tutoring was always the luxury of wealthy families and middle-class families. We're making tutoring available to every child in our country. The department had an initial target for the first phase of about 250,000 tutoring programs, so about 12 to 15 hours of 1 hour each for each student. Now that target is 2 million. That's a big scale up that I've got to make sure we deliver. That's a big focus of mine. And then, of course, you can't have great education without having great teachers. So we're looking at investing in 500,000.
Okay. But you only got a third of the money the
opportunities.
advisor suggested. How much did that hurt?
Well, the initial data I'm seeing from the tutoring programme, for example, in primary is worked really well.
So Sir Kevin was wrong. You didn't need 15.
No, what I'm saying is
you either did or didn't need
I've
15.
got great respect for Sir Kevin. What I would rather say to him is, look, I've got 5 billion. That's a huge amount of money to spend. Let me make sure I deliver that recovery, that catch up, and I'll look at the data, share it on your programme and share it with the country, as I did with vaccines, because data and transparency is my ally in this journey. And if we've caught up, great. If we haven't, we will keep going and make sure that everybody's caught up.
Let's get one last question in, if I can, Education Secretary. Nick in the Wirral. Nick on the Wirral, and you're on the radio. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Nick. Good morning, Minister.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question was originally concerning my dad and the booster vaccine, but of course, as of this morning, I'm in exactly the same position.
Right.
And we both had for vaccine 1 and vaccine 2 the Oxford AstraZeneca, and yet that's not being offered to us as a booster. Can the Minister answer the question why that's the case?
And that's also personal experience, by the way, Secretary of State. I had 2 AZs earlier, but last month I was given Pfizer. Why the change?
Nick, great to talk to you. Yes, you're absolutely. I had AstraZeneca as well, Nick, and I will be having my Pfizer booster.
So have we lost faith in AZ?
No,
AstraZeneca?
not at all. AstraZeneca is a great vaccine. It is the backbone of the vaccination programme globally, protecting the rest of the world as well. But we did a trial, Nick, called Cov Boost, with the great Jonathan Van Tam, who was overseeing it, and we used all the different vaccines as a booster. So Pfizer, half dose of Moderna, AstraZeneca and so on. AstraZeneca was good, but Pfizer and Moderna gave you a massive uplift in antibody protection.
Define massive.
10 times. It's extraordinary, I promise you. It is absolutely incredible, which is why we've gone with Pfizer and or a single dose of Pfizer or half dose of Moderna. It is the right thing to do. Make sure you get your booster.
Is the value of AZ slightly debased then?
Not at all. It's still a really good vaccine.
Just not as good.
But well, it depends how. So it depends if you're having your first dose of vaccine or the booster dose of vaccine. So as a booster, we are in a very fortunate position to spend more probably per capita on trials of how the vaccines effectively protect people, and our trial demonstrates that actually the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna half-dose vaccine does deliver the highest level of protection, which is why we've gone with those.
Final question, this one from me. Has sleaze gone away, Secretary of State?
So I think it's important that we had that debate and that we have now asked Chris Bryant and his committee in Parliament to make sure they look at the recommendations that the Prime Minister has put forward. For example, that you have always got to prioritise your constituents. You know, as a Member of Parliament, my constituents come first. And of course, as Secretary of State for Education, I do my job as the Secretary of Education.
But did they come first when I read you were earning £1.3 million pounds from Gulf Keystone until you became a minister?
Yes.
You were able to earn £1.3 million pounds as well as look after your constituents.
So, right, the big debate we have to have is, do we want people, engineers, I'm a chemical engineer by background, architects, doctors, nurses, teachers, lawyers, do we want Parliament to be enriched by people who have other professions? My answer would be
you were
yes.
certainly enriched, respectively, by £1.3 million. There's no doubt on that.
It depends how much. Right. So there are different earnings in different industries. The head of JP Morgan earns $25 million a year. Prime Minister of this country.
He's not the MP for Stratford-on-Avon.
I don't disagree with you, but the Prime Minister of this country earns much less than that, but has probably an equally challenging job. So different sectors have different earning quantums, if I can put it that way. The important thing that actually we've put forward is to say you can't get a second job as a backbencher. Of course, as a minister, you have no outside interest, zero, right? But as a backbencher, you can't have a second job just because you've become a member of Parliament, i.e., for lobbying purposes. That's already not allowed. But you shouldn't have one as a political advisor, for example.
Right.
But you can have another job if you are a doctor, a teacher, an architect. I would go as far as saying an entrepreneur. Why wouldn't you want wealth creators who may earn huge amounts of money? A programmer, someone who writes a piece of software might earn them £1 billion. Should they not be in Parliament?
Should we know what she makes, though?
Of course, absolutely.
But I read that a lot of yours have gone through a consultancy firm, Zahawi.
So I was director of that firm. And
how much money is in there we don't know about?
No, everything you have to list. So the reason Keir Starmer came under pressure the other week is because he earned £25,000.
This was from the law firm.
And wouldn't list his clients. When I was a backbencher, although I was working for Zahawi as a director of that company with my wife, I still had to list all of my clients. So there is no one that I would have been working for that is not listed for Parliament to be able to scrutinise. That's the important thing. And I think it's right that if Keir Starmer do that work, he should list who the clients were. Because I think the more transparency you have, the more informed the debate would be on this. Because I think this is an important debate. What kind of Parliament do we want?
Ultimately, where do we want to get to? Ultimately, because of course it is wholly right that we have men and women who work as doctors, who even work as lawyers. I understand that. Where do we want to get to with? So we have entrepreneurs and others, men and women who do, because we don't just want people who are attractive, who don't have any background in life.
But that's ultimately that is the debate in the court of public opinion, right? People have to decide, and we have this committee that I think will do some really good work on this, and I hope consult on this and then bring it back to Parliament. Do we want a Parliament of just full-time politicians, or do we want a Parliament that has the entrepreneur, the programmer who may have sold his business or has a business worth £1 billion, or a teacher, or a doctor, or an architect, whatever it happens to, I remember Roy Jenkin used to always thank his constituents for allowing him to be an author. Now, if you're an author, whether you are, David Lammy, who's one of your colleagues here, or anyone else, we need, as a nation, I think, to have this debate. What do we want our parliament to look like? At the moment, we get into this whole thing about the quantum of how much money people may have made outside. As long as they've prioritised their constituents, and as long as they're not making money because they've become a member of one, i.e. it's a tool to earn money because I can be a political advisor, that's wrong. That's what the Prime Minister wants to stamp out.
Enjoyed our time together. Thank you very much. Good luck to you and your colleagues in the very important sphere of education. Nadhim Zahawi, Education Secretary, appearing on LBC 9:36. News is next.
The Education Secretary's told LBC that anti-vaccine protesters should not be going anywhere near schools or pupils. But Nadhim Zahawi has rejected calls for exclusion zones and says the police will act where required. 5 people have been killed and more than 40 injured after a car crashed into a Christmas parade in the US state of Wisconsin. Footage posted on social media shows an SUV